The next speaker that we're gonna have is Padraic Monaghan. Thanks a lot, Padraic, for accepting our invitation. Padraic is from the Department of Psychology at Lancaster University in the UK, and he's gonna talk to us about moving artificial statistical learning tasks closer to natural language. Thanks a lot, Padraic. The floor is yours.
Yeah. I'm going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing over the last few years where we start with the laboratory-based language learning tasks, and we've gradually tried to link them to what life and language is like outside the laboratory a little bit more. So the talk by Tristan and by Lucia were really interesting, wonderful work, looking at the formal structure really of language and how our minds respond to that. What I've been wondering about is the extent to which treating language as this sort of formal structure and removing it from that communicative purpose, the extent to which that really changes the task for people. And so we've been looking at trying to place it a little bit more as a communicative task and looking at how the processing changes as a consequence. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So here are the classical paradigms for looking at artificial language learning to really study structure, study what the mind is capable of in a limited amount of time and in a really controlled setting. So really good reasons for doing that. So basically in these tasks, you listen to some sequences or you view some sequences, as we've seen in previous talks, and you have to try and figure out the structure, either explicitly through instruction or implicitly by just sitting back and letting it wash over you. And here are a couple of illustrations of the kinds of structures that have been looked at. So there's a Reber classic grammar, which is like a little Markov model, which shows the sort of transitions you can go from one state to the next in your grammar. And typically these are presented visually in terms of letters or numbers or shapes. Okay. Or you can have musical sequences as well, reflecting the different statistical structures, different artificial grammars. Or you can have speech sequences, as Lucia talked about in the last talk. So here's that example from the Safran study in 1996 again, where you have these continuous sequences of speech. Babiku, daropi, golatu. This is really what it sounds like. Babiku, daropi, golatu, etc., etc. And the participants have to listen to this and then respond in some way to it, either with their minds or with their fingers responding on a keyboard or whatever. And typically when we run this sort of experiment, we get a kind of range of responses from these very artificial language learning tasks. So some of the participants end up like this, some like this, they really get frustrated by it, and others, come at us with hammers sometimes. So doing online experiments is sometimes a really good idea. But if you then try and change this slightly from just looking at the structure, the formal structure of the language, to make it a bit more about communication, then things really seem to change. So there was this lovely study by Conier and colleagues in 2010, where they had those Safran style sequences of continuous speech, but they added in pictures of things that the words in the sequences of speech referred to. Okay, so they kind of co-occurred with the onset of each triplet in the speech. And participants were able to do this. They were able to segment the speech. They were also almost simultaneously able to link particular words to particular reference in the language as well. And when we try this sort of change, giving something that language refers to, then our participants really prefer this kind of study. And any study where we have a referent, something that the language is referring to, something in the world that they can link the language to, then our participants have a slightly different response. It's sort of less artificial language learning. Here's a typical example of one of our participants. And just as a sidebar, if you look at the amount of time to collect these kinds of data, when we first began running these very artificial studies, they ran quite quickly, but as the word spread around our student community, people stopped volunteering for our experiments. And the data collection took longer and longer as the sequence of artificial language learning studies went on. But we've been looking at giving some meaning to the language and seeing then what changes. So how do we go about that? Well, when we have this sort of less artificial language learning, there's all sorts of advantages to this. So it gives the language meaning. It makes it a communicative task. It gives it some communicative relevance. And that switches it out of just the formal structure to some sort of interlocution between the language and the learner. It also means that you can provide some structure in the world as well as in the language. And again, Lucia's talk looked at how you can change some of the structure in the world and how that then might relate to learning of sequences. But you can then actually look at possibilities of how structure in the world and structure in the language interrelate. So open possibilities of looking at in one versus the other, complementarity of that information. You can also look at how different aspects of the language iconically
we're losing you
breaking up.
Can you like get back like 20 seconds?
Yeah, okay, I'll put some more redundancy into my talk. Yeah, okay. So here are some of the advantages. You have some meaning to the language. It seems to change it quite radically, shifts it from being about acquiring formal structure to acquiring something communicative. It also means that you can vary the amount of information that's present in the world and in the language, the kinds of structures that are present in the world and the language, and the correspondences between those structures as well. Lucia talked about some of the structure you can present in an environment, in a visual environment, and how that might affect processing. You can also look at investigating redundancy as well and complementarity between information present in the world and in the language. And hopefully I'll have time to present our last study, which looks at that in a bit more detail. It also means you can look at multiple and multimodal cues for learning as well. So language isn't spoken in a vacuum. It's spoken in a really rich, multimodal situation. And we can actually build that into the language learning study to see how that affects people's processing. And it also means you can look at learning vocabulary and learning of syntax. Now, if you just have a very artificial language, then it's really hard to figure out whether you're learning categories of words in a particular lexical category and then relations between those lexical categories, or whether you're just learning relations between individual words within the structure. Once you have meaning, then you can present vocabulary items and distinguish them from the categories of those vocabulary items. So we do need to acquire both vocabulary and grammar. And this is a long-standing problem called the chicken and egg problem that goes back a long time and covered in detail through Lila Gleitman's work. Now, the idea here is that you need to figure out what a word means to figure out its role in a sentence structure, but you need also to know about its role in the sentence to be able to figure out its meaning. So which do you learn first, the vocabulary or the grammar? Well, one way this has been addressed is to provide some kind of world environment for a language to be learned. And a prime example of this is Brocanto by Angela Friederici and colleagues over the years. And they presented this sort of world here that their language would refer to. And so here they had intransitive sentences. So you have a noun doing something with some sort of adjective occasionally. But it's just an intransitive. So it's just one object moving. And you have a language describing that. And their participants learned for days and days this language. And first of all, they were trained with the vocabulary. So Angela Friederici and colleagues solved this problem of learning vocabulary and grammar by getting people to learn the vocabulary first. And then they learned the grammar over days and days. Okay. So our participants are just too impatient to come back day after day. So we needed something that would work a little bit quicker. Also, it's pretty hard, this task of learning vocabulary and learning grammar when you just have intransitive sentences. It's even harder when you have transitive sentences. So here's an example that, again, is brought up by Lila Gleitman. So if you have these transitive sentences, the porpoise gives the penguin a present, or the penguin receives a present from the porpoise. Now, grammatically, they're very, very different, but they would describe the same scene, the same event in the world. So how could you distinguish give from receive without first understanding sequence? Because what you're looking at when you hear these two sentences is going to be pretty much similar in terms of the event someone's describing. Well, the solution to this is actually via another problem, which is called the Gavagai problem. And if we were allowed to gather in Trieste, then this is what we'd be seeing. And if a native speaker of the Trieste dialect said Gavagai to you as you saw this run past, then after getting over your horror at the size of this enormous rabbit, then the question you'd have to ask yourself is, what does the speaker of this local dialect mean when they say gavagai? Is it the rabbit? Is it the running? Is it the general beauty of this Trieste scene? Well, this was resolved by providing an artificial vocabulary learning task, but with some sort of environment, some sort of world to accompany it, by Ewan Smith. And actually, it has a longer history, but this was taken up in the last decade by these two. And in this study, they gave people 2 objects and they gave them 2 words. And from a single trial, you don't know which word refers to which object. But over multiple trials, then you see a co-occurrence of one of these words, ball, whenever you see that round thing in the environment. And if you can acquire these cross-situational statistics, then you can learn to map each of those words to things in the environment over multiple instances. So it's a solution to this gavagai problem, the problem of many possible reference for each word, by looking at what's present in your environment and what's present in the language when you're viewing that environment over multiple trials. So that's what we started with. And in this first study that I conducted with Karen Mattock in 2012, we had a look at making this a little bit more complicated, putting a little bit of structure in the language, but also making the world a little bit more difficult to acquire. So children hear language and not everything in the language refers to something in the world, okay? But what we did notice too, that in child-directed speech, parents seem to be very careful about their use of words that indicate the grammatical structure of language to help the child understand what is going to be the referring word in the language. Let me give you a little bit more detail on that to try and make it a bit clearer. So here's a corpus analysis we did in this paper, and we took the Anne corpus, which Anna Theakston collected in 2001. And here are some example utterances from this corpus. So mother says, "Do you think the penguin wants a sausage?" And then later in this discourse, the mother says, "Chocolate." And then the mother says, "Is the penguin eating the chocolate?" Now, when the mother uses this very short utterance, chocolate, then what we see is very often the noun is used without any other words around it. And in particular, the use of the article is much less carefully applied for shorter utterances. But when the utterances are longer, the articles are much more reliably there in the child-directed speech. As in that first example, do you think the penguin wants a sausage? And is the penguin eating the chocolate? And similarly for verbs, we see a lot of use of very high frequency words, pronouns, that precede the verbs. But when a verb occurs in a shorter utterance, then it's much less likely to be preceded by a very high frequency word. It's less likely to be marked in the grammar as a potential referring word for an action. That's the idea. So when the utterances are long and complex, there's more information in the grammatical structure to help guide the child to what the important bits of that sentence are likely to be with respect to the world around them. And we're suggesting that you use these articles reliably, and that's going to be helpful for cutting down the number of possible referring words in the sentence to apply to the world around them. Okay. So we had a go at putting this into an artificial language. We had 15 adult participants per condition in this study, and we had 10 objects, which are indicated here. So these came from FISSA and Aslin's study, these sort of like abstract shapes. And we had 10 words, one of which referred to each of these objects. And we had 10 further words, none of which referred to any object, just sort of randomly occurred with any of these objects. And we had various blocks of training where participants saw 2 objects. They heard this phrase, which contained a referring word and a non-referring word, but the participant doesn't know in advance which is which. We had these different conditions. So we had a no structure condition where we just had 2 words, one referring word and one not referring word. And the participants saw 2 objects, one which was referred to reliably over multiple situations, one which wasn't. And we had a structure condition where we added in a little bit of grammar. So in this case, we had a different function word that preceded the referring word and another function word that preceded the non-referring word. And the order of the referring and the non-referring word was randomized. And the participants chose one of these objects as the dependent variable, and no feedback in these any of these studies actually. So here's one example of what our participants did. They heard a phrase like nu pacrid tha makot, and they saw two scenes here, and they just had to click on which one they think the phrase referred to. Now, the nu indicates that pacrid is a referring word, and over multiple trials, every time this word pacrid was present, this object here was actually present too. And so over multiple trials, if the participants are sensitive to the cross-situational statistics, then they should be able to pick up this. And if they become sensitive to the grammar of the language, so using nu to indicate what the referring word is, then we should see a boost to acquisition in the structured language versus the language without any structure, without any of that helpful information like articles that parents seem to present for their children. And here are the results. So the blue line is when we have internal structure, when we have some grammatical structure in the language. And the red line is when there is no internal structure to the language, just the words, the referring word and the non-referring word. And this is a proportion correct for whether you choose the correct referent for the phrase. And here we have across 8 training blocks. And critically here, we see a divergence in terms of the learning over time. So as you go on, then there's more and more advantage to picking up on that internal structure of the language, the grammatical structure of the language to help you in acquiring the vocabulary items relating to the world. Okay, so in experiment 2, we had a look at whether participants could learn not only nouns from this kind of language, but verbs as well, and whether they could learn those simultaneously. And in this study, we had now 8 objects and 8 actions within our scenes, and those corresponded with 8 nouns and 8 verbs in our language. Lots of blocks of training. All these experiments take about half an hour, so participants are in and out fairly rapidly. Now, the language was pretty much same as the structure condition of the first experiment, okay? Except that now we don't have a referring word and a non-referring word. We have a noun and a verb, okay? And in the structure condition, we precede the noun and the verb with a different function word. So it's a little bit like applying an article in the language before the noun, and a little bit like placing a high frequency pronoun before the verb, something like that, right? So a marker for what the verb is. We had word order varying. It could be subject verb or verb subject. This is an intransitive language. And the participants had to choose one of the scenes that were presented to them when they hear one of these utterances. Let me try and make that a little bit clear about what we did. So this is what a participant sees. Hopefully the animation works for you as well. Yeah, so they see 2 of these nonsense objects moving in different ways, and they hear a phrase, and the phrase refers to the noun, and it refers to the object, and it refers to the action, and it may or may not be preceded by a marker word depending on the condition. Okay, so this is just the condition where we have this syntactic structure as well, grammatical structure in the language. And we see that over multiple blocks of training, again, all within about half an hour, our participants learn to sorry, shouldn't use that word, especially when Jamie's around in the audience. But here we have the accuracy in terms of participants' ability to select the scene that is referred to by the sentence. Okay, we get up to about 80% accuracy within about half an hour. So they're learning the relation between the sentence and the scene, but are they learning the nouns and the verbs, or are they just learning the nouns or the verbs? To test that, at the end of the training, we had some additional testing where we had a final verb test where we had the same object, but doing different actions, and participants had to select which of those scenes was being referred to. We also had a final noun test where we had different objects, but doing the same action. So this is a verb test, right? And this way you can only distinguish these scenes if you know the name of the action. And for the noun test, it's the same action, but different objects. You can only solve this test if you know the names of the nouns. And what we see is that there's a slight advantage for learning the nouns, but both nouns and verbs are learned greater than chance. We have 2 testing blocks, but that's just a detail. Chance is 0.5. Participants can do this about 70 to 80% of the time correctly for both nouns and verbs. So participants can acquire nouns and verbs, and they can use this syntactic structure simultaneously with acquiring the vocabulary to help them in acquisition of this language. So here's experiment 3. Now we're scaling things up a little bit to try and see whether for more complex scenes, we can learn many more different types of grammatical category simultaneously and learn from a more complex language. And this is a paper that's just out. Patrick Monaghan is the first author in cognition. So can we learn words from multiple categories, we were wondering. So we've looked at nouns and verbs, but can we also learn adjectives? And can we learn also the role of function words, words that don't refer to anything explicitly within the environment? And can we also acquire some sort of more complex syntax via this same principles of cross-situational learning as well? And for this study, we had 20 adults. And here are our materials now. We have these sort of range of different aliens. And each of these aliens could actually occur just in red or blue, change the colors of them, so that the adjective referred to the color of the aliens. And we got these aliens to do different things to one another in these animated scenes. I couldn't get an animation working for what participants actually saw. Sorry about that. Hopefully I'll give you a flavor here. So these are 3 stills from the scene. So here's a wee red alien jumping over a blue alien. So it approaches it and then it leaps in the air and then it lands the other side. And the aliens are depicted performing one of 4 actions. So one either hides behind the other, jumps over the other, lifts the other, or pushes the other in these dynamic scenes. So in the vocabulary, we have 8 nouns, 1 referring to each alien. We have 4 verbs, 1 for each action, 2 adjectives, 1 per color, red and blue. And we have 2 marker words as well, which refer to whether the noun is the subject or the object in the sentence. And our grammar was a little bit like Japanese. It was verb final, but we varied the order subject, object, or object, subject, verb, word order. Okay. So here's written out again what the language, the structure of the language is a bit like. So we have an optional adjective followed by a noun, followed by the marker indicating whether this noun is the subject or the object, another optional adjective, a noun, and then another marker word indicating whether this noun is the subject or the object, and the verb is final. So can participants learn this kind of language? Again, they see 2 scenes and they hear a sentence. They have to select which scene matches the sentence. And the training blocks each lasted about 1.5 minutes, and there are a few of them over about half an hour session. And after every 3 training blocks, we had this mixed train and test block where actually the participants' experience was the same. It's just that we focused on one aspect of the language to test whether participants were sensitive to that aspect of the language. Let me show you what that means. So this is what a participant would see, 2 scenes. So these are animated scenes, and they hear a sentence a bit like this. So Hagel chilad tha gashel sumbad nu tisle. So that's blue, alien 1, and alien 1 is the object. So this chap here. And then gashel sumbad, red alien 2, is the subject, that's the thing doing it, and jumps over. Okay. Red alien 2 jumped over blue alien 1, or jumps over. So during the test trials, we varied one thing between these 2 scenes to focus on that aspect of the language to see if participants are sensitive to it. So for a noun test, the 2 aliens, one of the aliens was different between the 2 scenes, but the colors were the same, the actions were the same, and the agent-patient assignment, subject-object assignment was the same as well. For the verb test, everything was the same apart from the actions between the 2 scenes. For the adjective test, a color of one of the aliens changed. And for the marker test, it's just the subject-object assignment was different. Okay, that's a pretty hard task to solve, actually. So here's an example of a verb test. It's the same subject, it's the same object, but the action is different, jumping over here and lifting up here. We also had some syntactic test trials where we looked at sensitivity to word order. So here's some results of the learning trials, proportion correct over the blocks, above chance from block 3. So after about 5 minutes exposure to this language, participants could do this better than chance. So overall, they can match this complex scene to a complex sentence. But what is it about the language that they're actually picking up on? And here are the different tests of the nouns, the verbs, and so on. So what we see at the top here, in terms of accuracy, is the syntax. So pretty quickly, participants learn the grammatical structure or the word order of this language. So the kind of formal characteristics of it. And they also learn the verbs quite quickly. And you'll note that the verb always occurred finally. So there's some sort of salience to that position. And that's acquired quite quickly. And the nouns are learned gradually, but pretty quickly by test 3. 3/4 of the way through half an hour of exposure to this, they've already got this above chance. The adjectives are a bit more sporadic, but they learn them by the end of training. And the marker words, overall, they've learned them above chance. But again, it's a little bit going in and out of consciousness, I guess. But overall, participants are able to acquire all these. And in a different study, we looked at the order of acquisition of these different aspects of the language, studied by Neil Walker and the rest of our team, and found this acquisition order: verbs and syntax first, then the nouns, then the adjectives, and then those marker words. And they do acquire those complex marker words, even though they don't explicitly refer to anything in the scene. So we're not the only ones to try to add the world back in. So Marto McDonald did this in I can't see the date, sorry, it's a bit behind the panel. Yeah, 2010. And Fenna Politique has been doing this for years and years as well, adding worlds into languages. And she's had quite a bit of success in learning very complex hierarchical sequences as well, when you add in something to which that language refers. So some success there. So there is information in the world as well as in the language. And if you know one bit about the language, then the world is going to tell you a little bit about the structural role of that word in the sentence. So for example, if you just know that Sumbad refers to that alien there, the spiky alien, then you can pretty much unpack the rest of this sentence from that information. And it also means that there's a degree of redundancy as well. So if you know that this is Sumbad, then the world is showing you that this is the thing doing the action. You know it is the subject, and you don't need the language when you have the world simultaneously to tell you what the subject of the sentence is. Okay, so you know this is the subject. Okay, so can we manipulate or make the most of this redundant information in the environment to help us out in gaining some understanding of the language? So it's certainly the case that there's redundancy. And it's certainly the case that some languages do without any grammatical markers for what's the subject and what the object is. Typically, they have more fixed word order than Japanese, for instance. But what happens if we rely on the world telling us what the subject and the object is? We make the language a little bit ambiguous, but together with the world, the ambiguity is resolved. Can participants still learn this kind of language? That's what we were asking. So this is experiment 4, which is with Heike Holtz and a former student called Heather Murray. And it's in preparation. It has been since COVID began. I'm not the only one in that boat, I don't think. So, but here's what we did. So it's similar to experiment 3, where we had complex scenes and we had complex sentences. But we used animals now instead of aliens, but we gave them new names. And we didn't have adjectives, so we pared down the language a little bit. And we had longer training blocks, but fewer of those training blocks. So again, it was about half an hour overall, this study. And here are 2 scenes from the lovely animations that Heike Holtz made: cows jumping over a hen, or I think this is a case where an elephant pushes a zebra. And we had 3 conditions here. We had a marker word condition, which was a little bit like experiment 3, where we had the marker indicating whether this noun was the object or the subject. Similarly, this mark indicates whether this is the object or the subject. We also had a random version where the marker could be either the object or the subject. So the marker made the same complexity of the sequence, but didn't actually help you in terms of learning the structure of the language. We also had a no marker word. Now this is underspecified because you don't know whether this is a subject, the first noun is a subject, or the object from the language itself. You can only figure that out by learning correspondences between the words in the utterance and aspects of the language. So this no marker word condition is a critical one. Can you learn this even though the language is underspecified? So we're placing some of that structure into the world itself. Now, learning is better than chance for all these conditions. So this blue one is a bit like experiment 3, where there's markers for subject and object. And over the training block, we see rising accuracy, get 50% chance, rising accuracy to better than chance by the end. No marker words, it looks slightly better. It was not significantly different overall. And the random marker words should be a little bit harder to learn. There's a little bit less structure in the language and also complex language. But again, it's not significantly different overall. And it's by the end of training, it is. You can ignore that misleading information in structure and acquire the language. I'm nearly done now. Davide and Yamil, don't worry. We can also look at focusing on different aspects of the learning. So in the nouns and the verbs, when we test those separately, where we have two scenes and they vary just by one aspect of information, then here we are seeing an advantage now for the no markers condition. That's that green line there. Overall, there's a lot of overlap here, but that's actually a significant difference. The no word markers, when you place some of the information of the language into the world, then it is acquired more easily than when there's redundant information between the world and the language, and consequently a more complex language. So the markers performs worse than the no markers condition for both nouns and verbs. There's some advantage to getting rid of some of that redundancy, keeping things simpler. So just summarize what I've tried to get through. So making artificial languages less artificial does make languages more complex, but despite that complexity, participants can still learn them. And it's a relative term, but our participants love doing this when there is something to look at when they're listening to these languages. Our participants can also learn syntax and vocabulary simultaneously without feedback. And it means they can learn categories of words and not just individual vocabulary items in the language as well, and figure out the correspondences between those grammatical categories in the language. And they can do that in a really short period of time in these laboratory settings, slightly less artificial languages. And putting the world back into language learning really transforms that learning experience for our participants. So you get that redundancy, and it also means you can explore these issues about division of labor between information in the world and information in the language. And also you can look at interactions between structure of the world and of language as well. So there's kind of a natural history for events unfolding in the world as well, which are often reflected in word order in languages too, which again is something that can be picked up in terms of correspondences between grammatical structure and world structure. And Lucia was talking about that a little bit. But these languages are still not very complex. There's still a long way from anything natural here. So we only have about 16 words in these languages. And by the age of 5, children know about 10,000 words. So the degree of complexity we're still not capturing in these studies. Similarly, for the grammatical categories, we only have 4 grammatical categories so far. And in natural language, we have 12 or more. And so we're interested in how learners might acquire and cope with these different syntactic structures, rather than just the same syntactic structure presented over and over again in the language. And also, these environments are pretty simple as well. We're just presenting 2 alternative scenes, but typically when you hear an utterance, there's loads of stuff around you. And especially if you're a child in a preschool setting, really tons and tons of stuff on the walls. Everything is covered with stimulation, basically. How do you know what is being referred to in that utterance relating to the world around you? Okay, I'll finish there by thanking all the people who've been come and gone really in this project. Particularly Patrick Monaghan has been a constant over the last 6 years of this work. So thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Padraic. Thank you. Very, very nice and interesting talk, bringing us closer to the real language, playing around with grammatical classes and trying to go a little bit higher level now in the language. It's very interesting. Good. So you all guys know the drill. So if there's any question, fire up. I see one from Nicola. So you can go ahead.
So, hi. I really enjoyed the talk. It was really was really a nice story. I was curious, and I was also fascinated by the fact that they learn verbs and syntax very, very well and very probably fast. I don't know, but because my impression is that a verb at the end is a sentence by itself, while nouns they don't have structure. So a verb brings syntax. So it was kind of I was wondering, since at the end the verb was always at the end and was salient, as you said, did you try to move around a bit the verb, maybe trying SVO instead of having always at the end, and if the effect remained? Because if it remained also in that case, I would be really surprised, but also very happy.
Okay, yeah, we haven't in the complex languages, like we tried in experiment 3 and 4, but we have in experiment 2, where we just have a noun and a verb, we varied the word order of those. So the verb was either first or the verb was second. We've actually found no difference in accuracy for those trials. The verb was first or second. So it wasn't, but then, you know, you have that primacy effect. So the verb is always on an end in that second study, because you're only really having 2 languages or 2 phrases at least. So no, it's something we'd really like to look at, and in particular, thinking about you know, event structure in the world and how languages map onto that. If there's some sort of more natural expression of certain certain syntactic structures that might relate to the way in which we see events occurring over time. So there are, oh, here's an event occurring. My daughter's arrived. Oh yeah, that's lovely. Go on then. Yes. But yeah, seeing if certain word orders might be acquired more naturally, because they correspond more readily with the unfolding of a scene. So the subject tends to do something before an object, for instance, in an action, and it feels a little bit more natural to have that referred to, or that can be the focus. And you see it, you do see these changes in word order associated with focus by speakers as well.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's something underexplored, and I think the advantage, the early learning of verbs that we see is partly to do with them occurring at the end, which is a salient part of an utterance, but also that they have the most fixed position in the utterance as well. But yeah, it's on our list of things to do eventually. So,
well, really exciting, huh?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola.
Tristan.
Can you hear me there, guys?
You're always a little bit muffled, but I think we can understand you.
Okay, I'll try. Yeah, I mean, I really like these sort of proper geeky talks, and takes me back to go and read some of the papers to get the details. But I'm going to ask you something just very much from the detection to the production, because I remember discussing with artificial grammar learning people whether when the participants finish, can they actually produce a phrase, right? Have they done metacognition enough to say ha ta ha ta ha? It's a new phrase. They're not repeating. What's the level of capacity to interact in an abstract manner with this? Do you know? Muted.
Sorry, I lost my arrow. Yeah. I've also lost the question now.
Can they produce?
Yeah, the production. Yeah. That is a lot harder. It's really a lot harder to acquire the words and then use them. And it's not something we've tested in our studies so far. This is really just about receptive abilities for these languages. Yeah, and my feeling is you need a lot more training, a lot more exposure before you begin to be able to use those words in sentences. And very often in these artificial language learning studies, when you're trying to get production, you need quite a lot of scaffolding. So you provide the words and they're clicked on and placed in different orders, just to get over some of those difficulties of production. So even reproducing the phonological sequences can be a bit problematic. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to go from just reception to production, as the child does eventually. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was more a comment. So I think that there is also like a step in between, which is like, can subjects even store this in memory, right? Because you can say that the production is yet another aspect, right? But how much of these sensitivities that we see really are stored, And are all of them stored? Are all of them stored at the same rate? You know, and so on and so forth. So I think that all of these things interact in really complex ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this study I mentioned by Neil Walker, which came out in 2020 in language learning, he looked at what happens in learning next day. Okay, I'll help you in a minute. Go out. Children are just home from school. You know, the world is really impinging on my use of language. Sorry, I've lost my thread again.
Memory.
Can I ask another jump to in this to push you a little bit on, like, what about learning to learn, in the sense of, you know, like, you can think that none of these subjects are, you know, they might be naive to the structure that you are, you know, showing them, but of course they are not naive to the causal structures of the world and, you know, like all of the things that they have learned, right? So you know, how much of, you know, like learning to learn in the sense of, you know, they already know what kind of causes are relevant in some sense, right? And which ones aren't. So
yeah.
How does that play out?
Yeah, so they know that language refers to the world, and they know that language refers to event structures in particular ways. So you have nouns and you have verbs, and that's given in our studies. We've been rolling out some of these studies to younger children, but around the age of 12 months. 12 months onwards, they can begin to cope with these kinds of studies. Earlier than that, it's really tricky to get them to concentrate on anything as complex as dynamic scenes and longer sequences. So we've been fairly unsuccessful in that. From 12 months, when, you know, they already have, you know, begin to have a few words, they are able to acquire these kinds of languages. But going earlier, yeah, would be the thing to do. But doing that in an ethical way, where you can teach them sufficient of a language without, you know, to be able to test their responses to it, is going to be tricky. It's going to be a matter of exposure, I think. On that issue about retention, so the points come back to me now. So this paper by Neil Walker and the rest of us in language learning, he looked at what was retained 24 hours later. And actually there were some changes in the representation of the information. So in particular, the representation of the nouns improved with a delay. There's some kind of consolidation effect that happened to the next day. The verbs and the syntax were retained and remained high. The adjectives and the marker words, which had only been retained fairly inadequately, needed further consolidation for acquisition. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Padraic. Thank you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your questions. I think it's time to move on now. So thank you again.